I'm delighted to be joined here on the Celtic Exchange today by David Lowe. Some of you will remember David from his appearance earlier in the year in our Battle to Save Celtic series, and even more will likely remember him as the financial analyst and close ally of Fergus McCann, who played such a key role in the events that took place at Celtic some 30 odd years ago. David, welcome back to the show. Not much Celtic action to keep us busy at this moment in time, but how did you enjoy how things played out at the end of last season?
Well, we won the cup final. What a great end to the season. That was brilliant. The goal, must have watched it 50 times.
Yeah,
fantastic.
At least. Did you see that coming at the turn of the year? There was a few wobbles, wasn't there, under Brendan Rodgers' return?
No, the guy is a good manager. No question. He's got all that experience. He had his bumpy moments across the season, but no, I was pretty confident.
Yeah, quite happy with him remaining at the helm for the next couple of years.
Yeah, all the stuff that happened in the past is in the past. Winning football games, winning trophies, winning leagues, all that matters for me.
Fair enough, and let's all move on. We're here today, David, to talk about a number of things, but let me ask firstly about something that I'm sure a few fans are keen to hear about at the moment, and it's Celtic's current share price. There's been a few headlines and certainly some speculation on Twitter about why that might be, but just to give a bit of context, so today, Wednesday 17th of July, the share price currently sits at 165 pence per share, I believe. Just over a week ago, on the 8th of July, it spiked at around about 200 pence per share, which I believe is an all-time high. You can maybe correct me on that. And it's certainly the highest price since the late 2000s.
Well, it's not an all-time high.
Okay.
The all-time high was like a fiver way back in the 1990s.
So 500 pence.
When Fergus left, it was £2.80, and it had been sort of a long-term decline since the turn of the century, basically.
Okay.
But until very recently, it was very steady, just the right side of a pound, 110, 120. Then in the last month, 6 weeks or so, it started travelling up to around the £2 mark, which would value the club, when you account for the other two classes of shares, or three classes of shares, ordinary, preference and preferred. When you aggregate all of them together, it valued Celtic at £250 million, which is quite a lot.
That is quite a lot.
As to why the shares went up, well, that's a wee bit more difficult to determine. It is what's called a thin market. So that basically means you can only buy a little amount or you can only sell a little amount. So it doesn't take much buying to put the share price up. Mm-hmm. So that's basically what's happened. More buyers than sellers, if you want to be simplistic about it.
Okay.
But you then ask yourself, well, why? Well, it's the end of the financial year was in June. The figures will be very good. Another successful year on the park, off the park. This time last year, Celtic put out a trading statement, which was very positive. That was a forerunner of the financial accounts that get announced, I think it was August last year. So the accounts that will be coming out soon will be similarly good, and Celtic in a very healthy financial position.
And in terms of that thin market you speak of, David, does that mean there's potentially been some trading even at a fairly small level, in your opinion?
Yeah, there has been trading. All this is in the public domain. You know, you can see how many shares are traded daily, and it's in the tens of thousands on busy days, and it's in the hundreds on quiet days. So if you want to buy £1,000 worth, £2,000 worth, you can basically do that. And the share price goes up when more people are selling these amount, or buying these amounts, than selling. Okay. More buyers than sellers means it goes up. Vice versa, it goes down. Yeah. So there's been some interest in the Celtic shares, but it's an abnormal interest because the shares have travelled up so far, so fast. So you can speculate as to why that is.
Yeah, and just in terms of the change there, so as I mentioned, so 200 pence per share on the 8th of July. At the turn of the year, 1st of January 2024, it was 118.5 pence per share.
Yeah.
So that jump to 200 pence is a 68.7% increase.
Yeah.
Whatever way you want to look at it, that's a huge up.
Yeah, it's a huge up. But, you know, you could look at it, if it went to £2 and it's now at 165, that's a huge down. So the point I'm making is there's more buyers than sellers, push it up more than would normally be the case, and vice versa. So it doesn't take a lot of money, a lot of activity to exaggerate a share price rise and to exaggerate a share price fall. The main point I would suggest is it's abnormal, because it was Sleepy Valley, you know, for a year, 2 years maybe, gravitating just above the £1 mark. Okay. But Celtic's in a very strong financial position. They had 70 million quid in the bank last financial year, and they'll report shortly, and the figures will be probably equally as good.
Yeah, so I mean, is it To put it into something that myself and maybe others can understand, is it like, you know, the betting markets? If someone's, I don't know, 5-1 to win a certain title or whatever, and there's a lot of money or a reasonable amount of money goes on it, that'll shorten to 4-1, 3-1 and so on. Is it similar in terms of the supply and demand of the share market?
Yeah, bookies adjust their odds with the flow of money. So the equivalent in the share market is that if there are more buyers than sellers, i.e. more demand, the thing will go up, the share price will go up, and vice versa, the share price will go down. And it does not take a lot of money to put a share price like Celtic up or down. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, a few £1,000.
Okay.
It's the cumulative effect has taken it up to £2. But you ask why? I think it's because there's accounts to be reported upon, and they will be very good.
Yeah.
And on the park, the results are very good. So everything's sort of rosy in the Celtic domestic garden. We'll wait and see how it manifests going forward in terms of who we sign and what our ambitions are in Europe.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned there's 3 different types of shares, David, and again, you know, for my own knowledge as well as anybody else, ordinary shares, preference shares and preferred shares.
Yeah.
Could you give us just a basic explanation of what those 3 terms mean?
Well, Celtic was a private company up until 1994, and when Fergus came in, it went public. It re-registered as a PLC. They had a very large share issue in January 1995, which brought in a whole lot of fans as shareholders. And those fans were offered 2 types of shares. They were offered ordinary shares, and they were offered preference shares as a package. And it's these ordinary and preference shares that are most prevalent. There's more of them than there are the third category, the preferred shares. So ordinary shares are just ordinary shares. They have a vote and they don't pay a dividend. The preference shares that accompanied them pay a 3.6 pence dividend once a year. It's round about now, actually. And the preferred shares, which were issued in 2001, don't pay any dividend now. And they have a vote, and you can convert them into ordinary shares, as you can the preferred shares. I'm in danger of complicating it too much if I say too much more.
Let's not do that. Let's try and keep
But when you add it all up together, the value of the 3 categories of shares, it means the club's value on the stock market as of today is about 250 million quid.
About 250 million pounds. Okay, and we'll get to a wee bit more about that and the ownership and
sure.
And that kind of thing a wee bit later on. In terms of this current price, as I say today, 17th of July, the price is sitting at around about 165 pence at time of recording. And momentary spikes can happen in any market, so up to 200, down to whatever. Do you have an idea, a best guess at what will happen at the moment? Do you think that price will settle back down closer to the 118 we've seen at the turn of the year, or should it kind of bubble around about 165 for the foreseeable?
Well, who knows? And I've got to be careful not to give any financial advice.
This is not financial advice.
No, this is not financial advice. No, look, what happened was abnormal because the Celtic share price is usually in Sleepy Valley. You know, for prolonged periods of time, it gravitates up and down, 10 pence most. So to spike up from 118, 120 to £2 in a very short space of time is abnormal. Mm-hmm. It might go down again because it's down at 165, as you said, so it might go all the way back down. I don't think it will. I think it will probably steady because we are about to announce financial figures, and they should be very good. Yeah. Last year, Celtic updated the market with a trading statement, which was just basically a statement ahead of publication of the accounts. So I think it will steady probably around current levels until these accounts are published. So
Celtic, obviously, you know, as a PLC, they're a business, they're on the London Stock Exchange, but for us, you know, they're our football club, and most of us as fans don't pay much attention to that side of things. But does success on the park, League and Cup doubles, for example, does that generally affect a share price, or should it affect a share price? Does sentiment get involved when it comes to shares?
It should do, and it does affect the share price, because if you win football games, you usually win trophies, and when you win trophies, you earn more money, and your sponsorship, everything associated with the club is worth more if you're a winning club. And particularly in Scotland, you know, if you win the league, you go straight into this Champions League honeypot or money pot, and that in itself brings a whole lot of money into the club. So results on the park do affect the share price most of the time, not all of the time. and Celtic have had another very good financial year. The extent of the financial year is also influenced by players getting bought and sold. Last year, we brought in a lot more money than we spent, and we've accumulated a very large cash balance. I think it was 78 million quid last financial year. So Celtic are sort of very adept at playing the transfer market, if I can call it that. You only need one really successful transfer, a £25 million one, to be doing well. A lot of the smaller transfers there's a lot of losses there. You sign a lot of bad players, but as long as the money you get for the good player is more than the money you, inverted commas, waste on the bad players. As long as you get one right out of them. Good.
So one Kieran Tierney, one Jota, potentially one Matt O'Reilly.
One Yama all the way back. There's lots of them.
Big money. So at the moment, David, I think it's fair to say that Celtic, correct me if I'm wrong, are in the strongest financial position in the club's history. As you mentioned there, figures of circa 70 million at last accounts. Would I be right in projecting that the figures for the next financial year are going to exceed 100 million? Is that the position we're going to be in?
Well, you don't know for sure. I mean, the brokers are forecasting some really optimistic numbers, but Celtic's financial figures will be very, very good. There's no point trying to pin it down to numbers, because they'll be out, in a matter of weeks. It's not necessarily a good thing, to be so far ahead of all your domestic competition, because we are in a domestic financial league of our own, and this is the first time it's really happened, or the gap between Celtic and their nearest rivals, it's never been bigger in the history of... I'm trying to watch what I'm saying here. In the history of both Rangers, then we'll call it. The gap has never been this big, and that's not healthy. Because what does Mike Tyson get out of sparring with Barry McGuigan? Very, very little. You can only raise your standard of your sparring, with somebody of a similar size, to get the best out of your domestic competition. If you don't do that, you're going to suffer in Europe. And I think that's part of the reason why we're so crap in Europe, because the standard in Scotland's so poor. We don't have regular sparring partners that keep us sharp when we step up a gear and have to go into Europe. It's just not a healthy situation to be the biggest fish in a very small football pond.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. In my opinion. Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of fans will give someone like Peter Lawwell, for example, a lot of flack. People will be well aware of the 5-way agreement and things like that, where the accusation is that Peter Lawwell wanted and wants a strong Rangers. And to play devil's advocate, you can understand why he, at the time, Chief Executive of Celtic, would have wanted a strong Rangers, because, as you say, competition is healthy, competition is important. So can you understand any moves Peter Lawwell might have made at that time?
Well, it was the board that made it, but if you want to pin it on Peter, that's fair enough.
I don't. I'm just using the name.
But yeah, I mean, Celtic were... If you look at what happened to Celtic after Rangers were liquidated, Rangers were out of the league for, 5 seasons or something. So there's no Rangers, there's nobody to shout at. There's not really any seriously competitive games. And look what happened to the crowds. Ronnie Delia was there, the stadium was half empty, you had big drapes over the upper stand, the Rangers end, or whatever it's called. It wasn't a particularly healthy environment, and it was only when Rangers started to work their way through the system and came back into the league that interest sparked up again. We brought in Brendan Rodgers first time round, and suddenly Celtic was exciting again, and the games were all sold out, no danger. So whether it's Rangers or anybody else for that matter, you need domestic competition to keep you sharp, particularly as if your aspirations are in Europe, which is where my aspirations are. I grew up with a Celtic that competed very strongly in Europe, and I find it very difficult to getting humiliated by little diddy teams in Europe. And that's something I think the Celtic board should try and do something about.
In your opinion then, David, before we move on to the next section, quite pointedly, do Celtic need a strong Rangers, or at least a strong competition from somewhere in Scotland?
Well, it's both. You need a strong domestic league. Portugal has a stronger domestic league than Scotland. Holland or the Netherlands has a similar. as does Denmark, and that's good because every game is a competitive game. Not every game, but metaphorically every game. That's not the case in Scotland. There's very little domestic opposition of Celtic. Celtic are in a financial league of their own, and Rangers are nearer Hearts in terms of financial competition than they are Celtic. Celtic's worth 10 times what Rangers are in terms of stock market value. Celtic's financial numbers are like superior to Rangers in a way they've never been in the history of both Rangers clubs. And that, is great to crow about in the pub or with your Rangers mates. But if you want to have a competitive football team, it's not good. So you do want a strong Rangers because they are the second biggest club in Scotland, just as you want strong Hibs and Hearts. And I can see why in 2012, which I think was your original question, the 5-year agreement, which I might add included 2 Rangers clubs, the SFA, the SFL, the SPL, and 2 Rangers clubs were party to that agreement. So you do want a competitive league, so therefore you do want your biggest rival to be in the top league that you're playing in as soon as possible. So the powers that be wanted Rangers parachuted straight back into the top league. And of course, that wasn't to be.
To bring it back then to Celtic's current finances, David, as I say, arguably the strongest position in the club's history. Am I right in saying that the club have been entirely self-sustaining since 2005? I think I read that in the last few days. And that we don't currently make use of any sort of overdraft facility or anything like that?
Well, we do have an overdraft facility, and roughly since 2005, Celtic has been, to all intents and purposes, self-sustaining, i.e. it's living within its means. That was secured with another couple of share issues in 2001 and 2005. The one in 2005 sort of secured Dermot Desmond's position as the dominant, as distinct from controlling shareholder. But since then, and that's when Peter Lawwell came in first as head of finance and then subsequently came in as chief executive, with the mandate from the dominant shareholder to make sure that we didn't lose any money and we didn't have to have any more share issues or go into debt. So that's been true for the best part of 20 years now.
Yeah, so obviously an extremely healthy position, and you can't argue with the numbers. And as you've said, David, it's not speculation. The numbers are there for all to see. But from a fan point of view, there is a lot of frustration just about how Celtic operate, particularly with regard to the transfer market. There's a term that was doing the rounds that Celtic operate very well as a business, but not overly well as a football club, and there seems to be a bit of a disconnect there. There does appear, generally speaking, to be quite a risk-averse approach by various people at the club. It just seems to be the way Celtic operate at this moment in time. Do you feel, you've mentioned Peter Lawwell came in, during those times in the late 80s, and obviously Peter Lawwell is still the chairman of the club, and he's obviously no longer CEO, but Michael Nicholson, who did work with Peter, is now the top man. Do you feel the perilous situation or the position that Celtic were in post Fergus McCann takeover is perhaps what's guided the current risk-averse approach that some figures currently take?
No, I don't think it's anything to do with that. I just think we have a conservative, small c, board that run Celtic on a conservative basis. I don't think it's any more complicated than that.
Okay.
So, but we are a football club, and you can run Celtic on a conservative basis, but that need not mean that you hoard cash. So I don't see why Celtic needs £70 million in cash unless it's earmarked for something else. And what could something else be? Are they building a hotel, or Barrowfield's redevelopment's not costing that amount of money. So that money should get used to reinvest in the team. They should, if they think they're successful at player trading, and a lot of these foreign players and domestic players come to Celtic as a stepping stone into the big riches available in the Premier League and further afield. You can put Matt O'Reilly into that category as an example of that player. And Celtic are sort of very adept at getting 1 or 2 right a season. They get lots of little ones wrong. I mean, the list's as long as your arm.
Yeah.
But as long as you're getting more right than wrong in terms of the amount of money, that's how you hoard cash. So Celtic are sort of pretty good at that. Rangers, for example, are pretty bad at that. So if you're good at something, you should do more of it. So I think there's a view amongst quite a lot of Celtic fans that cash balance should be used to do more of what you're good at. More player trading, better players on better contracts over more positions. So I hear that all the time when I'm talking to friends and associates with this.
And in terms of that cash balance, so Peter Lawwell, as chairman, had to put in his notes, I think, when they released the most recent figures, a borderline apology for hosting so much cash. It was quite a unique position to be in. We've kind of joked about it on the weekly show about the bizarre situation of having to apologise for having so much money. But is it, in business terms, is it folly to an extent to be hoarding that much cash? Is it risky almost to be holding that kind of money?
Well, it's not risky. It means you're very financially secure, but you're earning a few percentage points with it. If you're in the business of operating a football club, what do you need that amount of cash for? That cash should be invested in the football squad. You need better players on better wages. You need to do more of what we're quite good at, and that is unearthing jewels like O'Reilly and all the other players that have been here for a few years, then moved on. If you're good at doing that, why don't you do more of it? Why don't you use that cash to do more of it? Because all these players come here, whether it's Dembele back in the day or whether it's Matt Riley now, they're getting showcased. They're winning trophies. They're getting to play in Europe, not for very long, admittedly. So it's a great stepping stone. And if you get that right and you can sell these players into the big leagues for a lot more money, if you're good at it, why not do more of it?
Yeah, and just on that, and very briefly, just to ask you a question then. So last summer, a lot of talk about last summer's transfer window. I think Celtic made 7 permanent signings and they brought in Paulo Bernardo and Nat Phillips as loan signings at the time. But the 7 permanent signings, all of them seem to be in that they may go on to be something category. They were all £2 million-ish. They were all about 19, 20, 21. They might have played once or twice for their country or their under-21s. But none of them were ready for the first team. So it's guys like Louis Palma and Odin Thiago Holm and Yang, I think, and various others. We all know the figures involved. What do you make of Celtic following that strategy rather than spending, let's say, the 5, 6, 7 million required to bring in a quality proven first team player like a Carter Vickers or a Jota who they had to pay the big money for?
Yeah, everybody forgets Carter Vickers is a young guy. What is he, 22 or something when Celtic signed him? Maybe even then. Younger. Yeah, I can't remember. And they paid a lot of money. Was it £6.5 million? I can't remember. But that is an awful lot of money to pay for a guy at that age who couldn't get a regular game for Tottenham Hotspur. But it was a sensible thing and a good thing, and it's worked out. And he's still young and he's still worth a lot of money. And I hate to say it, chances are he'll go for a whole lot of money at some point, because that's why a lot of these guys come here. That's the gig. Matt O'Reilly's here for 500,000 from, was it Milton Keynes? I can't remember.
1.5 from MK Dons.
Yeah, on the basis that he gets showcased. He plays in Scotland. He's one of the best players in Scotland. He wins man of the matches. He wins trophies. He plays in Europe. He gets into the Danish squad. And guess what? Chances are we'll sell him for £30 million to a secondary team in the English Premier League or maybe in Europe. That's the gig. That's why he's here. That's why Dembele was here. That's why all the players that have come and gone, and you keep them in contract with years to come, and that's how you get the big money for them. That's Celtic's business model. Celtic's business model for the last 20 years is to basically buy flawed players or players on the up. And as long as you get more right than wrong, you're doing well. And by and large, we've done it well, but there's a huge list of flops. I mean, somebody should put some effort into working out the amount of money we've lost in flops. But it's more than counterbalanced by one jewel a year. Yeah, when you add it all up. And, that's how we've got 70 million quid in the bank. That's not really operational profits. That's playing the transfer market. And, it's a pretty sort of stable board. They've been doing it for a while. Brendan Rodgers is a very good manager, lots of good contacts, and chances are we'll have a good season next season.
Yeah, the player trading model is and has been very successful for Celtic, but I think the frustration from the fans' point of view is, we'll get circa 25, 30 million for Matt O'Reilly. but how much of that will be reinvested into the first team? Just a quick final question on this, David, before we move back to some of the business side of things. Do you see Celtic opening the purse strings this summer? We've already signed a young goalkeeper, and Casper Schmeichel will come in on a free, and a few others. Do you think we'll spend 5, 6, 7 potentially on a couple of bodies?
Difficult one. On balance, if it has to be yes or no, I think yes, they will. I think if this dual goalkeeper thing is as it appears, that looks smart, doesn't it?
It does.
Casper Schmeichel started off his career in Scotland, and he's sort of finishing it in Scotland, and he's been given a prodigy to develop. So nobody'd complain about that. That's the Brendan Rodgers connection. I think he had him at Leicester, I think it was.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. So for me, you should bring in like a Kaulaturi type thing. Did we not do that? Did he not do that first time round?
We did.
All the connections, all the experience, it rubs off in some of the younger players. Wee bit of experience and get some more players in. So I think they will spend money. But I don't say that with a tremendous amount of confidence.
Okay, and I hope you're correct with it. I mean, I think the point being, though, that a balance of transfer activities is what I think we would all be looking for as fans. You don't want to spend 5, 6, 7, 8 on 3, 4, 5 players, but you can do a couple of them and a couple of youngsters, a bit of potential, and find that nice blend. And the goalie, your situation in a microcosm is a good situation where you're bringing in experience and a youth to potentially take that position in years to come. But let's see what happens over the next few weeks there, David. Let's take it back to the ownership of Celtic. I want to speak to you for a bit of time about that and what the current position is. So if you don't mind, and I know this isn't an easy question to answer, but could you give us a very brief whiz through the ownership of Celtic over the years? So going back to the start, bring it into more modern times, and Fergus time, of course, up to the modern day. What's the gist of who has owned Celtic historically?
Wow.
Sorry to spring that on you.
So Celtic was founded as a club, as distinct from a company, in November 1887 by, as everybody knows, Brother Walfrid and a few other local worthies. And it played its first game, competitive game, in 1888. So that's how you get the 1888. But technically, as a club, it was founded in 1887.
Yeah.
And it was a club. What does that mean? It had members, like a tennis club or a bowling club. And football was still sort of amateurish, or amateur rather than amateurish. And because it captivated this sort of Irish Catholic, poor East End soup kitchen vibe, attracted a whole lot of traction. So it became very big, very quickly. But it also coincided with professionalism in the game. Professionalism in Scotland and in England, i.e. players getting paid money. So as soon as money starts changing hands, there's risk involved. So if you're a club, you have unlimited liability. You're responsible for the club's debts, whereas you've got limited liability. That's what you call a company, a Celtic Limited. So your debts are limited, essentially. So professionalisation creeped in the last decade of the century. Clubs started to incorporate as companies in the last decade, and Celtic became a company with a share capital in 1897. And this was a bit of a battle, if you like, between those that wanted to stay as a club, amateur, charity-focused, and the businessmen. And the committee members at the time were almost all of them were publicans. And, they didn't get to be a company. There was sort of arguing and fighting for the best part of the last decade, as there was with other clubs. But eventually it did become a company, and with shareholders. And I suppose that's when Celtic started to take off, because at that point it was, guess what, the biggest club in Scotland. And the biggest club in Scotland is determined by the most revenues in Scotland. It was bigger than Rangers, it was bigger than everybody else, and it became a company in 1887 with shareholders.
So that's in 1897.
The Brendan Sweeney, one of the Celts for Change guys, has written 2 volumes between 1892 and 1899, I think it was, which goes into all this in great detail. You've got to be a bit of a Celtic anorak to read all of it in detail, but I am that anorak.
Which is exactly why you're here. So 1897, we become, am I right in saying the Celtic Football and Athletic Company, was that the name?
Limited,
at
yeah.
that time? And on that very first board of Celtic, you've got guys like James Kelly, who had
Yeah.
played and captained the club, I think, and obviously
Yeah.
a distant relation at the time of Kevin
Yeah.
Kelly, Michael Kelly. Tom Grant's great uncle, forgive me, I forget his name, maybe
James Grant, yeah.
Was it James Grant as well? And obviously,
Not the Love and Money singer.
yeah. So you see the lineage there from
Yeah.
the Grants and the Kellys
The
from
dynasty.
1897 right through to
Yeah.
30 years ago. So beyond that, then 1897 to 1994, and everything that happens with Fergus and yourself and various others, is there much change in the structure and ownership of Celtic?
Not really. I mean, that was professionalism coming into the game. The businessmen take over, and you get this limited ownership. And certainly all the members at the time get offered shares. Very similar to what happened in 1994, 1995. But what happens is, with all football clubs, not just Celtic, it tends to be this is the only share that these guys will own. They'll own Celtic shares. They won't own shares in this, that, and the other company on the stock exchange. They'll own Celtic shares. Mm-hmm. But you're not really familiar with the protocols associated with owning shares, a bit of paper. What happens when you move house? You're supposed to tell the company. What happens when your mum or your dad dies? How do you get the shares from them? You're supposed to tell the company. You need a lawyer. There's protocols and procedures associated with owning shares. That was true then, and it's true now. So if you're unfamiliar with the ways of this, what happens is nothing happens. So what happens, or your house gets knocked down and you get moved to Castlemilk or Easterhouse or whatever it was back in the day. What happens was these shares tend to become untraced, i.e. nobody owns them. The guy died 30, 40, 50 years ago. So by the time you get to like the 1990s, half the share register is, nobody knows who owns the shares. So Celtic had a few share issues at the beginning of the 20th century. The last one might have been in 1919 or something. I can't remember. But around about that time. And between then and the Fergus takeover in 1994, nobody paid any attention to shares, share ownership, untraced shares. And what it did was allow a faction on the board to control the company. So there was 3 factions on the board. There was like the White faction. First of all, it was Desmond White, then his son Chris White. And before that, there was the great-grandfather Thomas White, the Kellys, and the Grants. And they didn't really get on much. So they had what I called a Warsaw Pact. That's like a non-aggression pact. They don't really like each other. All they've got in common is Celtic. So we'll form this bloc. It's like the Eastern Bloc, pre-Berlin Wall, and with that, that makes us in charge, and there'll always be something in it for us, and we'll swap the chairmanship, and we'll share the eckies amongst ourselves, and the rest we'll just ignore them because together we've got 60%. So that happened for most of the 20th century, and remember at this time there's no money in the game. If you were a big club in a big city, you had more money than a wee club in a wee city. And that's just the way it was. And the biggest city was Glasgow, so that's why Celtic and Rangers were the largest. Then you factor in the religious thing, and you get people that rally round the Irish Catholic thing. That's why we were so big.
Just again to help me understand, some of the kind of terminology and things that happen in that world. So when Fergus takes over in '94, around about then, or in early '95, he conducts a share issue. And it generates, is it something like 21 million over the piece? Can you explain in its simplest terms again, David, what that actually means? What was the process that Fergus was putting into play, and what did it mean for the structure of the club?
Well, prior to that share issue, Celtic was like a private limited company. On the face of it, it had like 100 shareholders, but 40 of them were lost, untraced, like I was just talking about there. So the remaining 60% controlled it, and there was lots of rumours, like this little old lady in Ireland, controlled it. Well, she did, but she died, and then her shares get allocated to an extended family. So as each generation comes on, the ownership becomes more fragmented, and by the time Fergus comes along, money is important now. So when money is not important, you just have to be better than your rival, because money is not important. Better manager, better results. So with money coming into the game, you really needed money to be successful, and Celtic had no money. The board had no money to invest. The shareholders had no money to invest. And the club, was in a bit of a mess. David Murray had gone a bit mental with Rangers borrowing money, and they were taken off, and we were getting left further and further behind. So you had to have change. You had to have change in the early 1990s, and Fergus had been sort of bugging the board for years, as had others. You got to do something about this. And it was a 2-year fight. But what do you want me to say about the share issue in particular?
Yeah, just exactly, what it meant. So it allowed regular fans to invest in the club. And am I right in saying that Fergus ultimately, he obviously came with a 5-year plan, 1994 to 1999, and he stuck to his word in terms of what he was going to achieve. But did he want to leave the club in 1999 effectively with fan ownership?
Yeah, right. So I got you. So he had a plan, and as all things with Fergus, it was unambiguously clear. I will come in and I will do this for 5 years. In order to do it, I will invest £8-9 million. But in return for doing that, I want 51%, because there's some tough decisions to be made, decisions that a lot of people won't like, but it's in the best interests of the club that we make these decisions now in order that we can secure the future forever and a day. Because with a lot of football clubs, you live in the here and now, and all that matters is the here and now, and you can make the wrong decisions very easily. So he insisted in having this 51%. So that, if there's any opposition, he had 51%, and this is what we're doing. And he put together a good board that were supportive of this general principle. But he also said after 5 years, I'm off. Mm-hmm. This is a 5-year project. It will take 5 years to deliver. And after 5 years, I will go and I will offer my half of the company to the other half. And what he wanted to see was a balance between the business interests and the fans, because one without the other is unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And that balance, that equilibrium has been lost to a significant degree since he left. But how he achieved that was at the beginning, we're having this large share issue, and the first big public issue in January 1995, whereby we brought in like 15,000 shareholders or whatever the number was. I can't remember the exact number, but it was huge. And because there'd been no share issues since 1919, and because we were second fiddle to Rangers, they were at 6, 7 or 8 in a row, I can't remember, it's too depressing. We basically unleashed this pent-up desire to support Celtic and to buy shares, and it became the most successful share issue in the history of football clubs on the Stock Exchange. And fans in their droves supported this share issue.
And is that figure of 21 million, is that pretty much the number at the time?
Yeah. So then, it's a big public issue. They were queuing around the block to buy these shares. People that had never bought shares before maybe didn't even fully understand, a lot of people, what they were doing. But it's an easy thing to do because you basically filled in a piece of paper. It wasn't all online than it is now. And you deposited it at Celtic, with a cheque. A lot of people don't even know what a cheque is now. And, that gave Celtic, together with Fergus's money and a few other wealthy supporters, the kickstart needed to do this massive rebuild. And centre stage in that was the stadium, because the Taylor report, as you know, was kicking in. And that basically meant that you had to have an all-seated stadium, otherwise you couldn't use the stadium. Celtic only had 8,000 seats in the South Stand, so we had to do this. So the immediate priority was to try and pay for this stadium over 3 seasons, whilst trying to put a competitive football team on the park. And that's very difficult when a significant proportion of your cash flow and your investment money's going into off-field activities. You have to do it to secure the future. But for every pound you put into the redevelopment of the football ground, that's a pound you're not giving to the football team. Uh-huh. Meanwhile, downriver, they're going Raj, as they say in Edinburgh, with the bank's money. And they're at 7 in a row, 8 in a row, and the tensions are high. But you had to do what you had to do then in order to secure the benefits that we're reaping just now. Mm-hmm. That's. I think most people will understand that now. But when Rangers are on 8 in a row, it's difficult.
Of course, we've spoken at different times about what I would call now the inevitable clash between Fergus McCann and Tommy Burns, because they were both in their own way, very focused on what they seen as the most important things for Celtic. Fergus was all about infrastructure and the future of Celtic. Tommy Burns, as the football guy and as a football manager and a lifelong Celtic fan, he was all about, overcoming Rangers and what they were doing, and you could see why that came to a head. But yeah, ultimately the £21 million that was raised at the share issue, that's what, in part at least, funded the stadium that we now see today. You mentioned the Taylor report, David, so that dictated that by August 94, all top flight clubs in Scotland and England were playing in all-seater stadia.
Yeah.
We had to move to Hampden temporarily, and lo and behold, somebody's doing that at the moment, but we'll get to them. We had to move to Hampden temporarily to allow that, and then the following season we moved back into the new Celtic Park.
Yeah, but before you leave this point, you think about what's happened since those tough decisions were made, since those arguments were taking place, with, to use your words, not mine, with Tommy Burns, Wim Janssen, and all the other naysayers. You look at the amount of trophies we have won as a consequence since then, as a consequence of those tough decisions at the time. We're kings of the castle. We have won 20 out of 25 or whatever the stat is. It's never in the history of Celtic have they been so dominant and won so many trophies as they have done since Fergus McCann and the board put this infrastructure in place.
Yeah. And I think you can see all sides of that. You've obviously lived through those times as well as many of the listeners, and 90s were no fun. It was painful to watch what was happening across the city while Celtic stumbled from one disaster to the other. You lose the League Cup final in 94 to Wraith Rovers. You eventually win the Scottish in 95 after 6 years with no trophy. And then the Wim Janssen season comes around in 98. But there's a lot of pain during that. And it's, I suppose, from Fergus's point of view, he was maybe looking at it from a short-term pain for long-term gain. And now we're experiencing the long-term gain, but doesn't make it any less fun at the time during the 90s.
No, it's horrible if you're a Celtic fan and you're losing, you're getting humped by your opposition. I think we even was Ferguson when we get beaten by Wraith Rovers at Ibrox. Paul McStay might have missed the penalty.
Yeah, that was November 94.
But it was horrible.
Yeah.
Being a Celtic fan, that's why I get involved, and I'm not having this. And there was lots like me. Winning's what it's all about, but you had to make these tough decisions.
So to take us almost right up to present day, and in terms of just getting really clear on Celtic's current ownership, David, can you take us back very briefly to 1999 when Fergus does move on? What does the ownership of Celtic look like in the aftermath of Fergus's 5 years? What's the position at the top then?
So Fergus is gone in 1999. Now he actually left in April 99, but his shares weren't sold until towards the year end. And you might remember even before that, we'd had a bid approach from a consortium. It was a highly leveraged bid approach about a consortium involving Kay Dalglish, Bono from U2 and Jim Kerr from Simple Minds. And it was rejected for two reasons. Number one, it was highly leveraged. And number two, Fergus had made this commitment to offer his shares to the fans. So Celtic were a pretty attractive proposition to a lot of people at that point. He went ahead with his share offer to the fans. And that was contested as well. There was a schism in the boardroom. The Celtic board, and Dermot Desmond in particular, wanted to control the sale of the shares to the fans. And Fergus said no, and it was done by his guys, including myself. And Dermot wanted a lot more shares than Fergus considered him entitled to. Everybody should be offered the same amount of shares. So there was a bit of a schism at the time, a bit of an argument at the time, bad blood, whatever phrase you want to use. But we got over that, and the share sale went ahead. Dermot Desmond increased his share ownership, but not control, or not to a dominating extent. And Fergus exited stage left and has been a sort of bystander to all intents and purposes ever since. But that was at the beginning of the sort of the Dermot Desmond era at Celtic. He inherited this board, and we went into the new century and had another couple of share issues, and it was those share issues that allowed Dermot Desmond to secure his position as the dominant shareholder. He got an exemption from the Takeover panel in the UK to go above 29.9%, and he ended up with roughly 40% of the ownership, and over time started to put together the board, that he wanted to have. And all the old boys started to leave. Sir Patrick Sheehy left. Brian Quinn, he was chairman for a while, he left, as did others.
So that takes us to the position just now. So as you say, Dermot Desmond starts to ramp things up in 1999. We're now here 25 years down the track, 2024. What is the general position then with regard to Dermot Desmond's stake in Celtic and others? So, and before you answer that, David, how many shares are there roughly in Celtic at this moment in time? Do you have that figure?
Well, there's like 3 categories of shares. There's like, off the top of the head, 95 million ordinary shares. What does that mean? That's like a share with a vote that doesn't have a dividend, and there's 94 million of them-ish. Then there's these preference shares that were issued at the time Fergus came in, and they don't have a vote, but they can be converted into shares with a vote on a 1-for-1 basis, and they pay a dividend. Then there's these new ones that come in, new ones that are still over 20 years old, in 2001 called preferred shares, and they have votes and can be converted into ordinary shares. So when you add up all of that together, it basically means that Celtic's got a stock market value of roughly 250 million. And if you convert all the shares to get the true underlying position, Dermot Desmond has roughly 40% of the company in terms of ownership votes. The other 60% is owned by 15,000 other shareholders, including some big shareholders. The second largest shareholder is a professional investment company in the city called Lindsell Train. And then you've got Chris Traynor, a Glasgow businessman, has got the third largest shareholder. Then you've got Mark Keane, son of John Keane, one of the Celtic good guys from the 1990s, and then everybody else.
Okay, so rough maths based on Dermot Desmond's rough 40% holding, he's got about £100 million in Celtic at this moment in time. Is that accurate-ish?
Yeah.
And what does that mean then? Does that, he's obviously not got the 51% that Fergus had at the time, but so he's not the majority shareholder, but he's certainly the most influential shareholder.
Well, I'd say he is the majority shareholder. So if you go back to what I was saying about in the old days, untraced shares, Celtic have a very serious untraced share problem. So what is an untraced share? It's as it sounds. Neither the company nor its registrars just basically the bookkeeper that looks after the recording of who owns Celtic shares. And in football clubs, there's a huge problem with untraced shares. So Celtic is no different in that respect. And that's because people tend to buy football shares because they support the football club, and not because they're wanting to make lots of money out of the shares. So they don't have any other shares. They're unfamiliar with, and this is very simplistic, but it's essentially true for a lot of people. They basically just want to feel part of the club. They're not familiar with the protocols associated with owning the shares. Like I said earlier, if you move, you got to tell someone, the registrars. If your father or mother dies and you inherit them, somebody's got to tell the club. So most of the shares in Celtic were bought in 1995 with a big share certificate in a scroll, and a lot of them went on a wall and in a frame. And it's the only share they ever own. And since then, Celtic's had 4 registrars. That's basically the organisation that manages the share register on behalf of the club. And all these shares that are on walls or in drawers or inherited, nobody has told the registrar, who owns them. So it has this cumulative effect. So if you're an untraced share, you don't vote. So if you're somebody like Dermot Desmond, for example, and I say, well, he's got 40%, when you take all his shareholdings into account and you convert the votes, that's 40% of 100%. But if 20% is untraced, 40% of 80% equals 50%.
Yeah.
So just as it was true in the old days, when tenements get knocked down and people became detached from their shares, guess what? History is repeating itself. So it's not particular to Celtic only. It's just what comes with the football club territory. Celtic has an escalating, untraced share problem. And what happens after a period of time, per the company's Articles of Association, and the Articles of Association are just the rules under which companies operate, the club can advertise these untraced shares for sale and sell them and keep the money. And they can do the same with dividends. These preference shares that I mentioned pay a dividend every year. And when that dividend is not cashed, that cheque is not cashed, it has a cumulative effect. And again, the board can appropriate these shares for the club. So this is what happens. And it basically means that Dermot Desmond has a controlling interest in Celtic when you account for the untraced shares. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. It's a matter of fact.
Okay.
That can be used wisely or that can be used otherwise.
I'll go back to the untraced shares thing in a moment because it is very important, I think, in the bigger picture. But again, and I know I've asked you to keep things simple, but does Dermot Desmond own Celtic? Is that too simple to say?
No, that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. So who does own Celtic?
Well, I don't know exactly how many shareholders there are, but if you called it 50, I think it's 20,000, might even be more than that. 20,000 people, 20,000 shareholders own Celtic, not Dermot Desmond. And they all have the same rights in the eyes of the law. Mm-hmm. There's 20,000 owners of Celtic PLC, which owns the football club.
Yep.
Dermot Desmond happens to be the biggest. That's it.
Okay.
But he has the same rights as everybody else, and everybody else has the same rights as him. He has a de facto controlling interest in Celtic because he's got more shares than everybody else. And the reason why it's controlling, because as I said, the untraced element rises each year. Mm-hmm. Does with every football club, because it's the only club shares that a lot of people own in their football club. So that's just the way it is.
Okay. To stay on the Desmond family, Celtic's most recent AGM, it was 22nd of November last year, Ross Desmond, son of, spoke up and he said, quote unquote, "My father grew up a huge Celtic fan. We don't consider ourselves as shareholders. We are custodians. In his lifetime and mine, we will not sell the club." What do you think about that statement?
Well, he said it. I mean, who am I or anybody else to question it? But I've heard lots of people say that in the past and sell it. In fact, I remember a bad Irish accent coming up when we were doing the takeover in the 1990s. I was in Fermanagh and this Irish farmer, had these shares. I might have told you this last time, so forgive me. I went to see him and he said, "Why are you here, Mr. Lowe?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to ask you to support the takeover of, we're trying to take over Celtic and do this, that, and the other." And he said, and if you don't support me, I'll buy your shares off you. And I said, "Oh, you think I'd sell you my shares, Mr. Lowe?" That sounds like a Cornish accent.
That sounds like your Fergus accent again.
And he said, "I wouldn't even say 100,000, no way, 110, no way, but if you made it around 120, you'd have a deal there."
Yeah.
So everything's always for sale. That's what I'm trying to say. At a price. That's just the way of the world.
Okay.
And Doug Ellis, who I did some work with, used to own Aston Villa. Mm-hmm. It's been in my family for years. I'm not selling it. How much?
Yeah.
And it's gone. At the sharp end of the market, everything is always for sale at the right price. That's just a fact of life. Mm-hmm. So I think that, sure, it's nobody's intention to sell the Celtic shares, but you never know. And I think it's important that all the other shareholders, I think it's very important for this balance that I wanted in the 1990s, which Fergus McCann wanted in the 1990s, a balance between wealthy fan ownership and ordinary fan ownership. It's important that there is balance there. Mm-hmm. It's unhealthy to lose that balance. And I think we've lost that balance. We lost that balance with these two share issues in 2001 and 2005, because by then that generation of shareholders were shared out, had too many shares. So each successive share issue had less and less fan participation. And that allowed those that participated to end up with a greater percentage ownership. Mm-hmm. And when you factor that into account with the escalating untraced share issue, then, it's way out of balance. And if Dermot Desmond or Nick Train as a combo or, wanted to sell control of Celtic, they could. Mm-hmm. That's all that matters. They could. Yeah. I'm not saying they will, but they could. Yeah. And That's because that balance has been lost. So as far as I'm concerned, I want to see these untraced shares dealt with. I want Celtic Football Club to come out with a proactive policy of uniting Celtic fans, Celtic shareholders with their shares. There's no point having a little FAQ in the website that's buried deep. You got to be proactive, and you got to play a role, play a part in encouraging Celtic families of former shareholders to get reunited with them. I think that's very important. I think it should be centre stage. And I know there's an embryonic Celtic Shareholders Association in the offing that will play a role in helping facilitate this.
Okay. We'll revisit that just in a moment then, David, 'cause I think that is important. But just to finish off on the Ross Desmond, Dermot Desmond sentiment of the time. So, as I say, he says on 22nd of November, we will not sell the club. And he very, very probably fully believed that at the time, maybe believes it still now. But the possibility is always there that things change, life changes, business changes. Do you have a genuine concern, David, that Celtic could potentially fall into the wrong hands at some point in the future?
Well, they could. I'm not saying they will. I'm sure that when Ross Desmond said that, he meant it. I'm not questioning anybody's integrity, anybody's honesty. But, I've been around the block myself. Everything's for sale at the right price. Doug Ellis, all the people at Liverpool, Newcastle, it happens. That's life. And I don't want Celtic to be like Newcastle or Everton, which is basically a plaything for anonymous owners or unsavoury owners or whatever you want to call it. I think we want to have a balance of ownership at Celtic between genuine fans. I don't think it's healthy for somebody like Lindsell, an organisation like Lindsell Train, to be our second largest shareholder, because they are unemotional. They have no interest in the day-to-day things that matter to Celtic fans that are shareholders, winning games. They basically have bought that in a fund to make money. It's making money that's important for Lindsell Train. It's one of their worst performing investments. And when it starts to do well, what they'll be doing is saying, well, should we keep this or should we sell it? So you then say, well, we're going to sell it. Who are we going to sell it to? Dermot Desmond can't buy it because he's got over 29.9%. So who's it going to go to? So these are the sort of questions you ask yourself if you're in the financial game, because I don't want Celtic to be like Newcastle or all these other clubs, just playthings. You wake up one morning and you find your club's owned by who? We should have a say in that. And if all the shareholders, because we're still the majority, the fans are still the majority shareholders here, if we aggregate them together, then, we can have a say in the future direction of the club.
And I want to focus in just a moment on the question of potential fan ownership at Celtic or otherwise, as well as some of the ownership moves we've seen recently with some of the Scottish Premiership clubs. But just to finalise on the untraced shares and the lost shares at the moment, there's a quote from yourself recently, something you put out on Twitter, that a number of Celtic shareholders have become detached from their shareholdings for a number of reasons, and you've touched on them already: death in the family, relocating, housing, etc. And at the moment, for anyone that's listening, David, who might have or have had shares in their family or anything like that in the past, is there info or somewhere where any such individuals can track down their shares in Celtic?
Well, there is. When I was involved with the Celtic Trust, we put together, we worked with Celtic to do this frequently asked questions thing, which deals with the whole subject matter of untraced shares. But it's not which answers a lot of questions, but it's not promoted in the way that it should do. It's half-hearted. You've got to go, well, first of all, you've got to know that your family got shares to go looking for them. Secondly, you've got to know where to look. And thirdly, you've got to know how to go about it. So Celtic should be centre stage in this initiative. There is no reason whatsoever why they shouldn't. So rather than sort of burying deep in the investor portal on the web, they should basically have it centre stage. They should have a dedicated person in the club with a responsibility to help reunite Celtic families and shareholders with their shares. That's what they should do. That's what they were asked to do back in the day when I was at Celtic Trust, and it's not happened. But they still have the ability to do that. If they don't think they can do it, you can engage outside agencies to do it. It's their job to do this, help reunite shareholders with their shares. It's not a big deal, and there's no reason why Celtic shouldn't be doing it. If they don't do it, this new Celtic Shareholders Association will do it.
Yeah,
and we'll pay somebody to do it, because it's very important that fans own a significant percentage of the club.
Yep, so there is an FAQ, which I believe is quite useful.
It's very useful.
If you can find it, is
if
the
you
question.
can find it, that's
so
the point.
Absolutely, with anything of this nature, we'll include the FAQ in the show notes. So if you're watching just now, you'll see the FAQ link in the show notes, either here on YouTube or in the podcast version of this recording. Just in terms of the potential of lost shares, inverted commas, lost shares, David, do you have a ballpark, an idea of how many of those, or what percentage of?
It's huge. It's like 20%.
20% of Celtic could be lost.
So if you think about it, what Celtic did a few years ago was write to all the shareholders saying, we're going electronic. And unless you write to us and tell us that I don't want to go electronic, I still want to receive a report of accounts in the post and proxy cards in the post. Unless you do that, you're going to get a letter or an email with a link to the accounts. Well, if you think about that logically, where's that communication going to go to if you're flitted, if you lived in, pick a random, where are we? If you lived in Garnet Hill, we're near there just now, and you moved away from there 10 years ago, and that letter's going to go to Garnet Hill and nobody's going to see it. So nobody's going to respond to it. And if you don't respond to it per the Articles of Association, you cease to receive any communications. You cease to receive your dividend. Your dividend lies in the registrar's bank account. So every year this grows, and the untraced number grows and grows and grows. The same as it did back in the day at Celtic. The tenement gets knocked down. It doesn't, the communication doesn't go to Castle Milk by magic. It just becomes a dead share, an untraced share. And that's what's happening just now.
So the advice for anyone who thinks they might be in that position...
So it concentrates power in fewer and fewer people.
And as I say, the advice for anyone who finds himself or thinks they might be in that position is to first of all check out the FAQ. So as I say, we'll link to that, and look out for what you've described as the embryonic Celtic Shareholders Association. So is there talks ongoing to develop that organisation?
I don't have the bandwidth, the time to get involved in it, but it's a great idea which I'd be happy to support. And no doubt there'll be news of that at some point in the near future.
So watch this space, and that may be something that comes around pretty soon. David, in terms of fan ownership, we've touched on that, we've mentioned it a couple of times. I want to ask you a question about, I suppose I'd call it a trend that we're seeing at the moment in Scottish football, about US business types investing in various clubs. So at the moment, I think there's 4 clubs in the Premiership who have US owners. So St Johnstone, a guy called Adam Webb, who sealed a takeover just last week, 10th of July, over there. At Hibs, Bill Foley and the Gordon family from the late Ron Gordon, they own that club. Tim Keyes, US businessman, owns Dundee, and Mark Ogren owns Dundee United. And actually just in the last day or so, ex-Netflix vice president Eric Barmack, if I've got that right, he withdrew his offer to invest in Motherwell after the Well Society, which is a fan ownership group, urged their members to reject his proposal. Why do you think we're seeing this influx of US investment, US business types showing such an interest in Scottish football, and can they feasibly make money through it?
Well, it's all US money. It's everywhere. So it's not just in Scotland, it's in Britain, it's in Europe, it's everywhere. And it's basically because there's nothing really left to buy in the States. So if you look at the sports in the States, basically all the major sports franchises, they call it, are owned by private equity or big families, big individuals, but they're closed shops. You have very few expansion franchises. So again, and I work with some franchise owners in the States, and this was explained to me at the time, this would be like 20 years ago or something, that the way that these sports franchises in the States are run is you basically buy the sports franchise for as little as possible, employ a chartered accountant, a Peter Lawwell type, if you like, because Celtic's run this way, and then make sure that that person runs the company or the business or the franchise in such a way that the owner doesn't have to put in any more money. So what that means is, and this is how it's described, it's called the two-check principle. You buy with a little check and you sell for a big check. And in order to do that, you have a CPA in the middle running it for you. So
CPA.
that's a certified public accountant, or an American CA, basically.
Okay.
And that's how sports franchises are won. So because there are no more billionaires and because there are more private equity companies in America than there are sports franchises, simple supply and demand basically means the value of the sports franchises go up. And you've got this closed shop, and it's a lot more socialist, ironically, than in Europe, because you've got the draft, which helps regularize it. So there's no value really to be had in the States. So all this American money is looking at Europe, going, "Oh, we've got to have some of that," because everything's so cheap. And I remember back in the day, a guy who shall remain nameless, he only found out about the relegation thing after he bought the club. Tell me more about this relegation thing, Dave.
Okay.
I think he was fourth bottom at the time, and I'm not mentioning the club.
Fair enough.
Or the guy. So they're all hunting for bargains. So they're all crawling all over Europe. And again, from the past, what do you want? You want a big fish in a small pond, or do you want a small fish in a big pond? So that's the sort of debate that takes place. So a lot of the value has already been purchased in continental Europe. So people are now looking at big fish in small ponds. So what is that? You look at the Irish League. The Americans are all over that, particularly Irish Americans. Dermot Desmond owns 25% of Shamrock Rovers. Half a dozen other Americans own half a dozen other clubs in Ireland. And it's the smaller leagues they're now looking at. And indeed, Hibs come into that category. So the Irish Americans, I think they're Black Knight Entertainment out of Las Vegas. Yeah. Bill Foley and another guy. They're right into Hibs. I heard they're looking at, can't name the club, but a big club in Dublin.
Okay.
And I wouldn't be surprised if they were interested in Celtic and being spurned. So they're all over the place. They're all looking, in Carlisle United, another club I used to be involved in, they've been bought by a transport company in Tallahassee or something. So all these guys are all looking for clubs, and most of them, I have to tell you, will lose most of their money.
Well, that was my question.
Because it's a different psyche, it's a different environment altogether.
So I struggle to get my head around that. These guys are obviously successful business types from what they've done in the States. They've earned certainly millions, if not billions in some cases. So let's take randomly Tim Keyes, who's taken over Dundee, using your two-check model. He's bought potentially with a relatively small cheque. Is he ever going to walk away with a big cheque from Dundee in Scottish football?
No. What's the point?
So it's hard to get the head around.
Unless it's fun. Unless you're going to make some
a bit of sport,
serious dough, some serious money, or you're having great fun. What's the point? Dundee United, I met Mark Ogren, I think it was, in Tennant's Bar. As I said, why did you do this? Stumped for an answer. I don't know. Maybe it's fun.
Okay.
But it's expensive fun, and I'm being slightly facetious here. How are these? What is the point? I mean, how much money has to go into Hibs? What is the point? The number 2 gig, I think, is available in Scotland. I'm going to try and answer my own question.
Okay.
I think Celtic are in a financial league of their own. I'm sort of going off the point here. Celtic are, in the history of both Rangers and Celtic, Celtic have never has the gap, the financial gap, the performance gap being as big as it is now. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, including Rangers fans in private. Celtic are in a financial league of their own, which is unhealthy in the long run.
Yeah.
It's great whilst it's there, but it's not healthy. That's why we get humped in Europe. The step up is too big because the domestic competition is too shallow. So it will eventually become boring, same as it did in the 70s, when we were winning 9 in a row. But Why am I telling you this? I've forgotten.
You're talking about the second best option in Scotland, so you're potentially not going to do anything with Celtic, but what would an American do at Rangers?
I mean, what are they hoping for? We are 10 times bigger than Rangers. Rangers are now, and this sounds like crowing and boasting, but it's based in financial numbers. Our value in the stock market is 250 million last time I looked. Rangers is 22 million. So one's on paper, probably not actually, worth 10 times more. We've got, if you look at operationally, 10,000 more seats times 50 quid times discretionary spend. We're always going to have more money than Rangers, and that means you've got this financial edge forever and a day, plus the money in the bank. So the competition, that's what the point was, is for second place. Because the gap between Rangers and Hearts is less than the gap between Celtic and Rangers now. And that's the cumulative effect of all those decisions that were made, guess when? In the 1990s, when McCann was here with his rock and roll board. And this is the benefits that to be reaped, the benefits to be experienced we're having now because of all those tough decisions. So the competition is between Rangers, Hibs and Hearts, and probably Aberdeen. That's the four wannabes.
And I wonder if the likes of Bill Foley at Hibs and any of the other US investors that I mentioned there, maybe they see the potential for at some point coming second in Scotland in the European qualification and the financial rewards that they bring. So who knows? There is a relevant example. Again, I wasn't aware of it, but just in the last few days or so, there's a clip doing the rounds from the Diary of a CEO podcast, and it's US businessman Scott Galloway. I think his dad was Scottish.
Yeah.
And he revealed that he and a consortium of US based Scots had a plan to buy Rangers. I think they were going to invest 10 million or thereabouts very recently. But he was talked out it by a friend. Don't know if it was a guy that met him in a tenant's bar or similar, but he was talked out by a friend who said, quote unquote, you'd be the most hated person in the UK, you know nothing about football, and you'd just be some American idiot out there. And he took that advice and he stepped back. But there is the proposition that someone could make investment of that nature in Rangers and potentially see some returns if they do it right.
I think that's their get out of jail card, euphemistically speaking. I'm trying not to be bitchy here, look, we've got 10,000 seats more, so you do the math, as the Americans say, and we've got this embedded financial advantage coupled with a very strong balance sheet, with 70 million quid in it or whatever the number is, right? And then to go back to the ownership points, we have the stability of having a very wealthy anchor dominant shareholder. That's a plus thing. So we have the stability that's been around for a while, and we're reaping all the benefits. What I was alluding to earlier was a bit balance, not about any revolutionary change in regime.
Yeah,
Rangers have none of that. They've got 10,000 seats less. They've got a stadium that's older and more decrepit. They have no Mr. Big. They have factions fighting behind the scenes, competing interests. They have no ticks, they're all crosses. There is very little positivity to be had downriver, as I call it, which on a superficial level is wonderful. On a long-term basis, competition, if you go back to you need a sparring partner analogy, it's not good because, we are too big for this league. We have to really screw it up like we did a few years during COVID to lose a league. We're favourites for everything because we've got all that money and stability. So it's what will change the dynamic is if somebody come into Rangers, they were sold Rangers on the quintessentially British malarkey. Look at the King and the Army and the Union Jack and all that stuff. And it's presented as the establishment club with a 50% chance of getting and winning the league, 50% chance of doing well in Europe. It has to be sold on that basis. And there are people in the Rangers ownership profile that are trying to bring that about. But you don't have a consensus. There was a spat last year or the year before about this Florida connection, part of the ownership profile is punting Rangers as the quintessentially British thing. And that's what would change the dynamic at Rangers if somebody was sold this and bought out the existing shareholders and invested a ton in refurbing the stadium and just refurbishing everything. That's the only way forward for them. But you've got the competing interests. It's almost like Celtic in the 1990s. You know, they're squabbling over a hold ship. You know, and unless there's a change in the dynamic, you know, I don't think Celtic's get anything to fear from Rangers.
Yeah, and just to bring it back to Celtic, David, as we start to close things out, ultimately, I was keen to ask what you would like the future, certainly in the kind of medium term of Celtic to look like. I think you've mentioned that you're not particularly behind fan ownership, but you like the idea of balanced ownership. So could you tell us what you would like to see and what balanced ownership would potentially look like?
No, that's easy. It's the situation we had when McCann was here, in which I was supportive of and remain supportive of, and that is a significant and organised fan ownership block, preferably wrapped around an organisation like a shareholders association. A focal point, a touchstone, whereby we can aggregate all this fan ownership via one outlet. I think, and that's very doable because it doesn't really cost any money. I think that's what's missing, because I think we've lost that since Fergus left. I think the fan ownership influence has waned. We've touched on part of the reason with the untraced shares, but success breeds apathy. You know, you're not really interested in any of this shit, you know, if you're winning everything. You know, who cares? You only care till it matters. That's when you care. And the boards don't tend to care about fans till they're needed. So we're not really needed as long as we turn up with our money. If you want to be cynical about it. But we need counter. I'm into balance, that's all. We need balance in everything in our lives, everything we do. And I think we're out of sync, out of balance just now. So we need to restore some balance.
And do you think it is vitally important that there is more of a voice from the fans at board level at Celtic?
I don't necessarily think you have to be represented on the board at all. I think you just have to have this ownership influence via the share block. I don't think, if I want to be bitchy, you know, I don't think the non-executive directors really represent, I don't think they're doing their job properly, quite frankly. That's why you need a shareholders association. Celtic have adopted a thing called the Quoted Company Alliance Protocols, the QCA. They've had it since 2018. This recommends that when you have a dominant shareholder that we have, that a relationship agreement be put in place between the dominant shareholder, in our instance, Dermot Desmond, and the rest of the board. But, you know, that'll never happen in the month of Sundays because they're all placemen. I don't think the NEDs, I'm talking about the guys that have been there for 9, 10, 11 years.
Okay.
They won't say boo to anybody's goose.
So you don't think necessarily that we need to have a fan voice in the board? Balance is important to you, but it is important that directors, non-exec or otherwise, are held to account.
Yeah. So if you go back to fanning the board, I mean, I'm not saying for one moment that the NEDs who are just sort of practically criticised are not Celtic fans. They'd say, we're fans on the board. So you have to define what you mean by fan on the board, you know, because you have to be just an ordinary guy with an ordinary job to be the fan on the board, or are you Brian Wilson or Tom Allison? They're fans, you know. I wouldn't take that away from them. So you've got fans on the board, but I don't think you get too much dissent on the board. If you dissent, you get kicked into touch at Celtic, basically.
Yeah. Okay.
So no, I think you need balance in the ownership rather than fans on board. And I don't think fan-owned clubs at the sharp end work.
Yeah.
I think you need business expertise, you need cooperation and balance. That's what you need.
Yeah, and it's perhaps the case that balance isn't quite there at the moment.
It's not there at the moment, no.
David, we've obviously covered a lot here today, but just as we start to close out, what do you think would be the most important message that any concerned Celtic fans could take away from this episode?
Well, on the park, I don't think there's too much to get concerned about. You know, we're the dominant force. We've got financial security. We're favourites to win everything. We've got an experienced manager. My only concerns would be that we don't invest as much on the park as we should do. And there's precedent to suggest that that's exactly what's going to happen. I hope it doesn't. So that's a concern. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not too bad a concern, is it? You know, how much money we're going to outspend the domestic opposition by. But fundamentally, for me, the club will outlive all of us. And it's important that we're not exposed to the risk of being passed on to a new owner that we don't like. And the way that we mitigate that risk is to organise the ordinary shareholders into a block, and we help reunite shareholders with their untraced shares.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, so there is the possibility of a Celtic Shareholders Association coming to light pretty soon, so watch this space for that. And as mentioned, we'll link to the FAQ on the Celtic website and otherwise.
That's a big thing, yeah.
Yeah, where people can find that information. David, thanks as always for sharing the information and for joining us here on the Celtic Exchange today. As always, it's been fascinating, and it's one that I'm sure that lots of supporters will find really interesting. Thanks again for taking the time to share your insights, and we'll see you again very soon.
Delighted. Thanks for having me.